Mr. Nelson, I had a great time talking with you Monday night. Thank you. And Mr. Stanley, this is perfect because your video on the question of what is self-destruction, I find really interesting. And like, what is self-destruction? Goodness, and Mr. Jockin, how are you doing today, sir? You doing all right?
Yeah, no complaints over here.
Excellent. I enjoyed our talk last week very much. And Ethan, good to see you. So, Mr. Stanley, so this is perfect because I've been wondering about the relation between experiences of beauty and experiences of self-destruction. Mr. Stanley's YouTube channel rocks, and he had some really fascinating audio review. I really appreciated your lecture on Karl Barth. I thought that was really good, and I'm always really interested on his hermeneutics of reading the Bible. So that was very good. And so, so the first thing, Mr. Stanley, I'm going to put you on the spot to talk a little bit about the concept of self-destruction, Giesance, and all those different things, which I find really interesting, because this question of like, why do humans seek self-destruction? I wonder if there's something about the experience of self-destruction tied with like a perverted seeking of beauty, where we seek to be lost in something to kind of be transcendent, and like the death drive is kind of a cheap way to go for that. So, Mr. Stanley, if I were to ask you some of the stuff you talked about in your audio to put you on the spot, I would love that very much.
Well, part of what I'm developing is kind of like a theory of self-destruction that's related to how we try to become like the ego. And I'm following in this Lacanian tradition of the ego as a dead object, not as like, you know, in a lot of contemporary psychology, the ego is kind of this like dynamic force in your consciousness. Like you need to kind of develop your ego, or like, you know, Freud talked about like strengthening the ego so we can combat the id, or you know, a lot of contemporary mental health discourse and theories about like re-narrativizing the self. But the Lacanian tradition is like, no, the ego is this it's an object that you're identifying with, you're misidentifying. So it's not anything dynamic. It's less than you are, in fact. And so I'm kind of getting at this theory of self-destruction, where we're trying to become like our ego, which is a dead thing. So we're like trying to kill ourselves to become the image of what we think we are. And I actually think that self-destructive behaviors are found in this oscillation between like, I'm killing myself to become like the ego, and then I get too close and I realize I'm killing myself. So I have to like kill myself to like come back from the edge too, because people cut themselves not only to punish themselves, but also to feel something at all. So like there's two ways that self-destruction can go. It's to feel anything, to feel something, or to kill oneself. And these oscillations are like flying too close to the ego and pulling away, and flying too close and pulling away. And so this is kind of what I've been trying to develop in my blog posts, and I kind of was talking about in that video that I posted recently.
No, I mean, it's a fascinating question, Mr. Arthur Gordon. It's a pleasure, sure, to see you today. And because the question, like, how is it that humans can will self-destruction? It's kind of bizarre, right? Because how can they do that? It's the same that Mr. Finnegan in his book on self-deception. How can humans self-deceive themselves? If you know you are deceiving yourself, then you're not deceived, right? Or irony as well, right? Like, how can you engage in irony and the baby is freaking adorable? And so, like, how can you engage in irony, right? And this notion, like what you were talking about in your video one, we experience objects as kind of having control, right? Mr. Fishman, it's good to see you, sir. Like, objects are stable, and we experience as ourselves as this kind of random collection of drives. We poop, we eat, and we have no control of ourselves. But look at this bookcase. This bookcase has control. Man, I would love to be a stable thing too, right? Like this bookcase. But if I'm a bookcase, I'm literally dead because I'm not a stable object. I am a process. I am a becoming, right? But there's almost like this object fantasization that occurs, right? But this idea, what's funny, like you're describing, is this interesting dilemma where we want to get close enough to being an object without actually dying, because if we died, you know, we'd be dead. And then withdraw, and then get closer and then withdraw, kind of like you know, Icarus flying toward the sun, right? You don't want to get so close and then pull back. And it is interesting. It does seem like something that has to be occurring with self-destruction, because it is very difficult for, well, I mean, if a human desires their destruction, then it's not really destruction. Like, it's kind of weird. Like, if you literally wanted your self-destruction, then yourself wants it. So it's not really self-destruction at that point, right?
It's like Tom Sawyer at his own funeral.
You know? Right, where you finally hear what people think of you. Exactly. I always love that part that Mr. Twain is getting at. And it's like Augustine talks about that there's no such thing as a bad motivation, right? Like, if you desire it, you think it's good, even if it's like killing someone, you would think the world is a better place without them, right? So likewise, if you desired your destruction, then in a way it stops being the same kind of self-destruction, right? So that's kind of that weird move we're kind of pointing at, which would suggest that self-destruction has to be this flirtation with something, right? And then one day you might go over the edge almost, right? In a kind of weird way. And then it's also, to Michelle, good to see you. And it's also like, and then also everyone, whoever wants to speak, raise your hands, flare gun, whatever. I don't have a baby to bounce. Matthew came most prepared, I have to say. Whereas what's interesting to think of beauty is like, it's almost like with beauty, there could be like Mr. Jockin will talk about the need to develop character, conditioning to have those experiences of beauty that have a kind of transcendent feel to them. Now we have to get into all that. Whereas like flirting with death also feels kind of transcendent because, oh, I did it. Oh, I got close and I didn't do it. Oh, I got close. But it doesn't require the same cultivation of virtue. So I'm interested on these possible overlaps between these different things. And then the other thing I'm interested in is talking about like on jouissance, the J word I cannot say, which is like the pain and enjoyment. I also kind of wonder sometimes if like the human race enjoys the apocalypse. Like if we find enjoyment always describing the world being at an end, like we're always talking about the AI is going to kill us or something's going to destroy us. And there is almost like an enjoyment in crisis thinking. And I was thinking about that as well, of where we like to flirt with a notion of apocalypse. But then if we actually started to undergo an apocalypse, that would be bad. So we pull away. And I was kind of envisioning as I was listening to your videos, sort of thought like that as well. But I've been thinking all those different things together.
Would you describe Nietzsche's will to power as flirting with death, do you think?
Well, that's actually a really interesting question because I think there's this weird, what's very interesting when we get into these topics, it would seem as if we're dealing with a lot of things that are very similar, but nuanced, and that makes all the difference in the world. Like for Nietzsche, you have to face death. You have to literally be at risk of dying. But it's almost as if the mode by which you face death is different. Mr. Rivera, good to see you, sir. I enjoyed your work on Badiou. I didn't get a chance to comment on. That was quite lovely. I'm actually very interested in Badiou. I don't know enough about him. I've read his ethics. I know like all the event stuff and whatever, but he's quite interesting. But there's interesting where in Nietzsche, it's like the difference between facing death. Let me ask you this. Is there a difference? It's almost like the difference between facing death and taunting death. Like one of them is like taunting death, this sort of like, you're getting the thrill, not because you're like facing fear or overcoming something. It's just flirting with fire versus this, no, this is the fire and I've got to like raise myself to the place to walk through it. There might be a distinction there. I think for Nietzsche, you have to face death, but it's not the same as this weird kind of flirtation with death that brings a thrill with it because you're flying close to the sun without, maybe the difference, I don't know, maybe the difference is the cultivation of virtue to face death versus the facing death without doing the work to be able to so approach death or something. There might be something there. I'm curious.
Yeah, I'm thinking about his where he says, build your city under Vesuvius and sail in dangerous waters. Like he says to like be reckless, basically. Like you should put yourself in crazy situations. Like it is I think that the will to power is describing this experience of the creature putting itself at risk, and like not in this like intelligent, calculating, like day trader sort of way, you know?
Wait a minute, you didn't make your millions off day trading? Oh, yeah, sorry. That's actually, okay, that's really interesting. Like, because at the beginning of book 5 of the Gay Science, he talks about open sea, going in the water. There is a kind of recklessness. So what's the difference between that? What's the difference between that Nietzschean recklessness that seems necessary for character and Lacan's self-destruction, or this self-destruction and psychoanalysis? That's actually quite interesting. What are those differences? Maybe only you can know those differences, right? Like Mr. Fishman is always amazing me, and I'll give it to Javier with his talk on rock climbing. You know, there's a form of rock climbing that's like self-destructive because what if you fall and die? But then there's another form of it where if you don't do something like rock climbing in your life, there's not a development of character that is necessary, right? So that line is really interesting to me. And also I'm always impressed with Mr. Fishman because I cannot rock climb. And his recent trailer video that he had on his channel was really beautiful and lovely, and everyone should look at it. So let me give it to Javier and then Mr. Jockin. Javier, good to see you.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, these are good questions. I think when we talk about like the Nietzsche kind of facing death, if we're talking about risk, So I think that the other version that we're talking about, like was it taunting death? To me, I would call that like the perverse enjoyment. That's not like really a risk, if that makes any sense. So for example, if a guy is like super addicted to rock climbing, right? It it's like a risk, but like not a risk anymore to him per se. It becomes like a kind of enjoyment. What becomes a risk, and this is going to be the relative part, is that where's the tension for him that causes the risk? Tension is going to be very important here because actually telling that kind of guy to like settle down would be probably more risk heavy for him than the enjoyment of rock climbing, right? Like being more grounded would be the risk for him. That would be dangerous, right? Because that's his enjoyment. Like this is the kick that you're getting from this. And like, yeah, you could die, but that's also exhilarating. But there is this other kind of death where it's like, if something's holding me on the ground, that's kind of fucking scary, you know? So I think there is a way to think about this kind of taunting and perverse enjoyment. I guess we have to say like the risk is relatively relative, but I would say that what makes it difficult is that sometimes we think we have this assumption that, oh yeah, I'm taking a risk and so on. But then in reality, it's kind of like this secret enjoyment for ourselves. So I think that's why tension phenomenology needs to come into the picture here. Where's the tension for the individual? Is it explicitly clear that this is a risk for an individual? And then we can maybe discern, are they taunting death or are they facing death? Because I feel like taunting is a kind of enjoyment. Like you're like, come on, come on. So like, come on. So I don't know. I'm really curious what everybody thinks about this. But yeah.
Well, I really like, whatever language you want to use. And Mr. Stanley, my boy's trying to say hi to your boy, and they're all waving at one another. And tension phenomenology is from Javier's channel, so everyone check it out. Mr. Jockin, good to see you, sir.
Good to see everybody. I mean, building on this point we're just talking about, I mean, I'm reminded of Nassim Taleb's idea of skin in the game, and more particularly of honest signals. So I bring that up because I've been doing a bunch of literature reading on the neuropsychology of emotion, and more particularly, most of the accounts now is saying that our brains are operating in a prediction model system. So what's happening is we're getting stimulus from our receptors, right, of perception, all the different modalities of it. And there's a correlate, basically there's like a synchronization going on between the outer data going in and the predictions in our brain. Emotions are said to argue to be when there's a disconfluence, some irregularity between the two. And that's what illicit emotion is. Now, it's really interesting because there's lots of accounts saying this is supposed to be in particular parts of the brain. That's not true. In fact, what regions of the brain get activated in this error result, basically, between the prediction and reality is variant from individual to individual. There is no systematic position, nor even pattern. It's kind of insane. But the reason I'm bringing this up because the original point being made about ego death and Lacanian mode versus the more contemporary psychological mode of self-image, self-love, is the idea this is a false idol. It's literally a predictional image in your mind. It's not the actual reality of who and what you are. I also say this because consciousness is much more than our awareness. I'm just saying that because that's an important detail. We acknowledge that existence is much more than our conscious awareness. And we know this from the very fact that we have retroactive rationalization, which is the most destructive, disastrous capacity of the human mind, is that we will self-reannihilate, we'll look at every phenomenon, and it's literally ideology. I brought this up in the last group net. Like when I talk about what ideology actually is, that's probably my argument right now on the spot, is this impervious to any argumentation or any movement by anything. You are self-rationalizing the datum coming from the past to self-justify your existence at this particular moment. No, it's not because I have viceful desires. I'm full prone of error. I misestimated. I had a wrong image. My prediction of reality, it was either esteemed too high or too low. No, those are not the reasons why I didn't get what I wanted or something didn't happen the way I expected it to. Oh, no, it's because of external causes that are not me. So these are all false images. The reason why I bring this up is two parts. Part one is the idea when people take risk, and I do agree there is a difference between the kind of subjective risk we think we're taking versus actual risk, where there's harm to be done. Normally, this is discussed in money. So if you're trading money, the idea you're putting your money on the line and you make your profit, you're justified because you took risk versus you lost the money. That's an also honest signal. An idea that people who continue to make money over a long period of time are honest signals because they are surviving over time. But more realistic, I think, to this discussion than Nietzschean, and also I relate to also like idea of like because he had a very much aristocratic war orientation, that Greek model of warfare, that war is the honest signal that you went into battle and you survived. And even if you actually got harmed, you still were honest. And actually, even if you died honorably, you were honest. Like there was a kind of sincerity in versus the kind of games of language, to use a kind of borrowing from from Gorgias. I forgot who is the person who challenged Socrates when he was saying, you want to play these games of language and these charms of the laws that are going that contain the wild passions of a genius, basically. I feel like Nietzsche was like looking at those lines to quote from him. He says by the Übermensch, this individual who's beyond any limitation of the charms of law or custom or anything like that. I just bring this up because it ties all together, where the idea of the self that's esteemed by psychology today is actually a false image and is actually completely disastrous because it's, as I just saw a comment about contest versus games, right? Like a real Aragon, like the real test of character shown through versus the artificial reality of language and laws and safe spaces, if I don't use a colloquial term to kind of grab it all together. And the idea that actually, most psychology is about saying, I know you're a great person. You're awesome. You're great the way you are. Actually, maybe the reality is, no, you don't. You suck. In like objective reality, you suck. I suck. You suck. We all suck. Because we're all full of error. We're all full of wrongful vices. I'm going off on this point. But the point is that the idea that we're literally tricking ourselves into psychosis by having these false images because they're not correspond to reality. And we need honest signals to correct us. And I just say this last note, ideally, when we talk about kenosis, the emptying of oneself, it's actually opening up the space to even allow the beautiful to even show up in the first place. A selfish soul that's self-loving is not beautiful. It can't be because it's like literally just grabbing onto a dead image. That's why I love this discussion of Lacanian dead image. Totally right. It's not alive in any sense. In fact, we're most alive when we sacrifice for others. Isn't that a fun kind of comment in general? Anyway, I'm done talking. I'm going to stop now.
No, lovely. Thank you, Mr. Jockin. I'll pass it to Hyrule and then Michelle. And I really like this point on honor, honesty, bringing those together. And Mr. Stanley has a wonderful piece talking about idols and Lacan and psychoanalysis. And Mr. Flores, good to see you. And Sam, outstanding. But let me give it to Hyrule. And there is all these paradoxical moves. Like when you focus on yourself, you make yourself fragile. When you focus on others, you can become more anti-fragile. Like it's very interesting how things work in that different way. But Mr. Hyrule, good to see you, sir.
Good to see you as well. Hello, everybody. Okay, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff there. I really liked what Javier was saying about how like the risk, like if you're a hardcore rock climber, a dirt bag, like the risk of getting a job and like settling down and not risking your life is more riskier than to continue climbing, right? Because like you're putting your whole identity at risk. You're putting your whole like way of being in the world at risk, right? Your whole value judgment is getting turned around. And so to me, it's a matter of like the duality here is like maintaining the category versus like challenging the category. Like I've been thinking about this in terms of art and like the purpose of art in the world, because there's two arguments that I've heard. Like there's people like Jonathan Pajot who wants to say that art is about creating objects that function in the world, right? So he'll say like the art of cooking is about creating food, and the art of furniture making is about creating furniture. And so the quality of the art, therefore, is how well it fits together. And I'll say that etymologically, the word art means to fit together. And so it's about how like keeping everything together, right? But then you'll have other people like Alexander Bard who wants to say that art is all about breaking apart the categories and challenging things, and it's supposed to be this sort of pathic expression that upsets the established order, right? And so it's like, they both make a point, right? Like I can see what both of them are saying. And so it's like, if your art of cooking is just the same, like you're just staying within that box, then it's going to become dead and boring and nobody's going to want it. But if you're trying so hard to challenge what is food to the point that it doesn't taste good anymore and it's not nutritious anymore and it doesn't serve its function in the world, that's not good either, right? So there's like this, I don't know, there's this back and forth. So I've just been thinking about that in terms of art, and I think that kind of relates to this discussion a little bit. But yeah, I really like what Thomas was saying too. Anyways, yeah, lots of good points. I'll pass it to somebody else though.
Outstanding. I'll give it to Michelle. Sam Willman, it's good to see you. And your piece on werewolves was freaking great. Werewolves are great, Sam. Well done. And I've been thinking about the instinct stuff all week. That was really funny. Mr. Flores as well. And I'll give it to Michelle. Yeah, Mr. Bard has that part where Global Empire, maybe where he talks about the difference between eternalism and mobilism, where there's always this tension where we want to eternalize something, but then that can make it dead. So then we want to mobilize it, but that can be too chaotic, right? And I associate that with the sociological tension, because we frantically have to finish this book. And like, actually, we got the final proof for Belonging again today. I don't think it sucks. It looked actually not bad on the page. And they talk a lot about givens and releases sociologically. And there is that tension that I think you see between Peugeot and Bard, between art being the kind of ordering, but not in a totalitarian fashion, but a fit-in-ness fashion. And then Bard also stressing how art is the breaking through those tensions. So I think that's a very good comment, but let me give it to Michelle. Michelle.
Hey guys, so happy to see you all. Just a really quick comment about Nietzsche. I think that's very good to bring up and consider about the recklessness of Nietzsche, Matthew. I was thinking recently though about just how reckless Jesus was as well. And I think there's something very interesting to really highlight, because, you know, Jesus is saying things like, you know, basically that, like, you know, you got to hate your mother and father. Now this can, you know, we can get into the translation and all of that, and that's true. But there is something that is just wildly radical too about what Jesus is saying. And I was really focusing lately on like the passage where, you know, where Jesus basically says, like, you know, if you drink this water, the water on the earth, basically, you always get thirsty again. Like, you always have to drink again and again. But if you drink the water I have, then you will never be thirsty again, right? You'll never have to drink, not ever again. And what's interesting is, like, I was thinking about how this could be kind of like, it's like, well, that sounds great. And then, you know, this is happening with the woman at the well. And she's like, okay, can you give me this water? You know, and then Jesus goes and kind of like digs into her life and sort of really connects with her and where she's at, right? Really meets her where she's at. But the point of the matter is that there's something that's wildly kind of like, so, okay, Jesus, you like, people will never be drinking again. Doesn't that mean they might be dead? You know, like, there's some strange sort of like that there could be something about like really actual death that Jesus may be preaching, you know, as well. And that I think is very, very important to take into consideration, because it's shocking. It's shocking, just as shocking as Nietzsche. So in my mind, I just think like that's kind of like a little bit of grace for Nietzsche, because I think there's something just as radical about Jesus too. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks. Everything's great. I'm loving it all.
It's important that like the message of you need to be born again was the thing that really offended people about Jesus's message. And they didn't get it. You know, he's like, you need to be born again. And Nicodemus is like, what, do I get back in my mom's womb? You know, they like didn't get it. But there's this, so like the connection between birth and death, because it's like, you know, at the same time that something's being like dying, something else is being born. So like, instead of saying like Jesus says, oh, you need to die to yourself, but then he also says, oh, you need to be born again. And like these two images are functioning in the same way. So something's dying, something's being born, and all in the same motion. So I think there's a lot there.
Yeah, I'd like to have been there for that talk where Nicodemus is talking to mom and saying, hey, mom, I need something. Are you free on Friday? I need just a little bit, okay? No, this radicalness, but Michelle, the key is that you take Jesus and just talk about him dying on the cross and leave out all the other stuff about his life. That will make everything way easier, okay? Just deal with that. And it's also interesting, Matthew, what I'm thinking now, like on Karl Barth, it is like that tension between going, scripture points to revelation. In the revelation is Jesus, right? So scripture is like John the Baptist pointing toward revelation, as opposed to a lot of people will say scripture is revelation. And it's very fascinating with that move, how that opens the door to potential chaos, because, you know, who decides what the Bible's saying? How do we figure it out? But if you don't make that move, then the Bible becomes practically God, even though no one directly says it's God, because you mentioned that, like, no one directly says the Bible is God, but I think the risk is that they practically treat it like it is and smack people over the head with it. But in opening that door, which is ultimately, and I'll give it to Javier now, you could say that tension between eternalism and mobilism. You have the scripture that's kind of solid, but then it's pointing to the mobilization of interpretation that's trying to figure out who the person of Jesus was. That opens doors. But as you know, Karl Barth gets accused of every possible heresy known to man because of the confusion of that work, right? But it's interesting to think of that suggesting this problem too, as well, to think through. But let me give it, and you've been doing work on exegesis, haven't you? Rivera's been doing Romans. I mean, of all the books of the Bible, you gotta do Romans? The heck, man. Okay, Javier, please.
Yeah, I mean, I've been having some really controversial takes lately, with my reading of Badiou and Lacan. But speaking of funny stories and radicalness and sort of sticking to this topic of death, I'm gonna stick my neck out here and say the most radical thing is difference. And kind of Badiou kind of made me realize this when he talks about love. He talks about how love is the emergence of two and seeing this world through difference. And so, in my opinion, like when we talk about facing death, it's facing difference. You know, it's like being in this realm and seeing it through difference. And how, and this is my favorite part, what Badiou says is that love has to constantly reassert itself. You have to do that reaffirmation again and again and again. And I think Pei, what's his name? Pei? He commented on my video and he was like, hey, are you going to do an exegesis on like on all the books? And I didn't think about it, but I think now I am. I started reading Exodus and and I was like, wow, this totally makes sense. Because my interpretation of miracles now is difference rather than the identity of the item. When like Moses is given the staff and it turns into a snake, to me, we typically connect miracles as like, oh, it's not rational or it's super rational or whatever. No, for me, it's difference. The miracle is difference. Because this is God's showing of him being with Moses. This is the emergence of Badiou's two scene, that I am with you. And so this is the emergence of difference. And this is how I'm interpreting my takes on this.
Personally, if the way that God showed me that he was around was by turning a stick into a snake, I would go with the rainbow. I'd be like, hey, can I see the menu? That would be good. And actually what you just said, I recently just ordered the Not To book that Flores has mentioned a few times. That looks actually quite fascinating. And no, there's something interesting about miracles as well, where snakes exist, sticks exist. And so you're not like bringing in a phenomenon that no one has ever seen, right? You're just changing expected causation, right? Like you don't expect a stick to become a snake. And in that breaking of cause and effect, that is suggesting that I am with you, right? There's like, I am here because I'm not, but it's interesting there too, because a miracle is not like a radical difference in the sense of like something occurs that has no phenomenological basis, right? And so you see a mobilism, eternalism balance there. There's a change in order, but then the moment the snake is a snake, well, maybe it, it goes back, but the moment the stick becomes a snake, it slithers. Like the stick falls into the logic of a snake and then it follows that logic and it's in there. So it's interesting to think of even miracles following a preset order according to which it's structured. But let me give it to Miss Willem. Miss Willem, it is good to see you today, ma'am.
Hello, good to see you too. Good to see everyone. Yeah, I just wanted to speak to that idea of a miracle as something, if you turn a staff into a snake, you aren't actually like bringing something unknown into the situation. But what I like about that example of miracle is that it kind of presupposes a common denominator underneath of both snake and staff, which is like within the purview of God to like exchange between. It's like it's sort of like the miracle is the transformation, not the the staff nor the snake. It's like this ability to just translate between like living and dead, like different, wood and tissue. Like it's just all like coming of his oneness, so he can exchange it.
That's a lovely comment. I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. Theoretically, if you were maybe a baby or never, what if you were in a world where you didn't know sticks couldn't become snakes? And so that wouldn't be a miracle to you. So it's interesting to think that recognizing it as a miracle requires a common denominator, like you're pointing out, right? That then you can recognize it as a miracle, which then means that it's almost grace in it because God's meeting you in terms that you can understand as him meeting you, right? Because if grace reached for you, but you didn't have a common denominator, you might not be able to recognize it as grace. That's a very interesting comment. Let me give it to Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, to build on that point, because when Javier I like to flesh out this point about difference, because usually the distinction is made between that and other. And I bring this up because usually difference means they're under a genera of some kind. They're common. So what Sam just said, basically being, and that's the thing too, remember, being is not a genera. It's something else. We don't know what it is. It's something else. There's lots of questions about that. I'll leave it at that. But I think this is going to build on this point because I bring it up because life and death, they're not, I agree with you actually. I think anyone with a theological account, if they're willing to, remember, one of the projects of philosophy is to prepare one for death. Ideally, it's to build the equipment in your mind to understand that death is not the other of life. It's a difference because there's something that's predicated of both. A being can be both alive and dead, right? But it's an attachment we can predicate to both. That's why I'm bringing this up. So it's not an pure other. But that leads to a problem. Then what is an other? That is the kind of we're running into a huge problem of is being univocal? Is everything just under this one chasm? There is no distinctions. I bring this up because I was on that lecture I was doing about the neuropsychology of emotion. The main proponent I was reading said point blank, there are no natural kinds. There is no distinctions. There is only like this like gradient continuation of existence, that there is no other. It's just differences all the way down or all the way up or whatever direction. So we kind of have a problem. We have a problem. How do we express this? Especially when we got to clarify where is other versus difference and where they come in. Aristotle has accounts on this, but I want to hear Javier's meditation on this point. I think it's a serious issue.
That was lovely. Let me give it to Hirut, and then we'll pressure Javier to speak. And I did not see that in the paper this morning about how everything's a gradient and there is no difference. I missed the opinion section. Dang it. I know that explains everything. And also I can tell you what the other is. It's barn cats. They appear out of nowhere. They're just there. They are just pop out of existence and then they vanish. It's barn cats. So that's the other. Mr. Fishman.
Yeah, so I just want to pick up on this idea that miracles demonstrate an underlying unity in creating difference, right? Because like it's interesting to think about how when the Greek gods show their power in the Greek stories, it's always kind of predictable, right? It's like if Poseidon shows his power, the seas rage, right? And if Zeus shows his power, the storm rages, right? There's lightning and thunder because Zeus is the god of lightning and Poseidon is the god of the sea, right? So it makes sense that like they're still acting within their own paradigm, right? But when a miracle happens, it shows that the governing principle of the snake is not the highest power, right? There is another power which is creating the governing principle of the snake and can turn it into a stick if he wants to, right? Only God can make the seas into something other than the seas, right? Yeah, and so it's just I just think that's a really good point. I just wanted to pick up on that like by creating this difference, it's showing that the principalities are not the ultimate authority in reality, right? That there is something which is upholding the principalities and has set them in place, but can change them if he wants to, right? So I thought that was a really interesting point. But yeah, I'll pass it on.
That's a magnificent point. And Sam, I like that distinction between miracle and supernatural. I'll pass it to who wants to speak. Now that makes me think, if a miracle unveils that the governing principle, the highest governing principle is not the thing itself to itself, that there's a higher governing principle, that right there would speak to unveiling that that objects as objects are idols. to think of them as things in of themselves is an idol, which makes me think of the great Owen Barfield, who makes the point that like if we treat things as being the ground of their own being, or able to exist independent of like our interaction with them. In the book that's extraordinary, Saving the Appearances, I think I've mentioned before, it's an extraordinary text. Owen Barfield, he was in the Inklings, friend with C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, all these Dorothy Sayers, all these different people. And basically what he wants to say is that all phenomenon are more like a rainbow. Like a rainbow is, you see a rainbow, he asked the question, do rainbows exist? And you would say, well, yeah, they exist. But he's like, well, wait a minute, a rainbow exists because of rain, eyes, and light in position, right? But it's not a hallucination, it's there. And he posits that the existence of objects could all just be like rainbows. Now, the argument is more interesting than that. But what's interesting is he says, therefore, to treat objects as things in of themselves, like that objects exist as opposed to processes or constant changes and so on and so forth, is idolatry. And that the world fell into idolatry by treating things as things, which then makes me think of the temptation of object permanence that Mr. Stanley talks about. And then I'll pass it to Mr. Stanley and then Mr. Javier Rivera, where then we as subjects want to be like objects because, look, they have power over themselves. They're not controlled by drives. Well, for Mr. Owen Barfield, that would be idolatry. And then what's interesting to think is the miracle as the revelation that objects are not their own ground, actually. That there's if they are allowed to appear as if their own ground, then that's within God's permissive will almost, right? You could use that language. They're allowed to manifest as if they are objects, but really ultimately they are not. In the miracle then would precisely be the revelation of objects as idolatry, in a sense, to use Owen Barfield's language, which is quite interesting. And I like what you were saying. But then, of course, it's interesting in that the only way to experience a miracle as that revelation requires a common denominator. Like a grace that of enough constancy to be able to make it intelligible as some sort of change, right? And so there's a grace all kind of permeating in that. That's very, very interesting. Let me give it to Mr. Stanley and then Javier Rivera. Mr. Stanley.
Well, I need to rep Buddhism here a little bit because like Buddhism is like, hey, we've been doing this for 2,700 years at this point, and I love that you said ground, and I wish that Daniel Zaruba was here because Nishitani talks about how everything shares and everything else is home ground, is that everything is being itself by being in other things, and everything is not being itself by being itself. So like, for instance, he talks about the instance of fire. Like fire is fire because it burns things, but fire is also fire precisely because it doesn't burn itself. So there's this concept where a thing is itself by not being itself, and that are like things are essentially both their interactions with other things, and they are in that they are not themselves. So there's this sharing of home ground where everything is in everything else. And Buddhism has this concept called codependent arising, which is kind of this very early concept in Buddhism, that basically everything that arises always arises in tandem with other things because of their essential relation. And so you always have to talk about things together. You can't talk about them individually. So there's a lot of resources in Buddhism to talk about this, because the whole point is like you are clinging to the idea of an object and it's just a production of consciousness.
That's a beautiful comment, and we should wake Mr. Zaruba up at 3 a.m. or whatever it is in Austria. So we need to do that. Javier, I love this idea that fire is fire because it doesn't burn itself. That's lovely. Javier.
So my take on this definitely has some like context, because I'm using Badu, but I'm not using like his common terms of like being an event. And the same thing with like Lacan. Like I'm not using Lacan and like his registers of like the real and so on. But yeah, absolutely judge me. So I reduced Lacan to his statement on love, right? That love is giving something that you don't have to somebody that doesn't want it. But actually, I think you can read the Bible just like that, like completely. Like, mainly because if you ever get a chance to, like, I promise you guys, you will find this story hilarious if you look it in the Bible. Read Genesis where Esau and Isaac get the blessing from Jacob. It's the funniest thing I've ever read, because Isaac pretends to be Esau. He gets the blessing from Jacob, and then Esau comes in. He's like, "Hey, Dad, like, what the fuck, Dad? Where's my blessing?" And he's like, oh, well, I can give you a blessing. Your blessing is to serve your brother. So I'm like, this is wonderful. This is the complete embodiment of Lacan's statement about basically love is the one thing that cannot be offered. And yet, even when you read the verse, Jacob kind of knows. Like, it doesn't explicitly say that he knows, but he goes, wait a second, this is the arm of Esau, but the voice of Isaac. Like, I'm like, come on, like, you kind of knew that it wasn't him. But anyways, yeah, so I've been playing around with Badiou and Lacan's concept of love and interpreting the Bible this way. So I can't really answer your question, Jockin, because it's like I'm kind of working within like a specific context. But I will say you kind of gave me this idea of like getting so controversial as to say God is difference, which is maybe even why we keep obsessing over the thing itself when it's really like the difference. And then also how historically in the Bible, like God likes to change his name and then also likes to, like he says, like the most changing thing ever. I am that I am. Like you think this is like this is my take too. I don't think this is an identity statement. I think this is a statement of difference. I am that I am. Which is funny because we typically interpret this as like, no man, like this is me, like this is my identity, this is who I am. But I actually interpret this as him saying like, I am that I am in a statement of difference. Mainly because it's always in reference to the promise that Moses is talking about, and so on. But yeah, I want to say I had more, but yeah, basically I'm playing with Badiou's concept that love is difference, and because Christians like to say the sentiment that God is love, I'm basically saying like God is difference. And I feel like you can actually find that through this reading of if you take Badiou's kind of statement. And it's been really interesting for me. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, I've always placed Genesis just below Garfield and above Calvin and Hobbes. So I'm glad you have the same feeling. It goes in, so that's perfect. Also, hey man, it could be a blessing to serve the brother of the Grand Inquisitors, right? People don't want friggin' freedom, they want miracles and slavery, right? So you're just not reading it from a Grand Inquisitor viewpoint. He's like looking at it, like, hey, that other one, he's gonna have to rule and stuff. No good. So you can serve him. It's great. You know, men want freedom. So, you know, it just depends if you've read Dostoevsky. It just depends there. But Mr. Jockin, please.
I mean, guys, I'm going to come with some spice because I'm just bringing it up because what we're talking about here, I'm just letting you know there's some serious consequences if we go down this route of argument. So I'm bringing it up because I bring this up because of one point. Definitionally, violence is metaphysically to do acting upon a nature of something against its nature. Like, so for example, when your arm's cut off and you're not supposed to be cut off, right? That's the definition of violence. So I just bring this up because it ties to my essay piece I did about Heidegger and basically pointing out if there is no substances, the thing for itself that has the word is dignity. So our magic word we use today to talk about this metaphysical concept is dignity, that things have dignity and should not be just acted upon because we have power and we can act over them. So we can take your pick. I mean, we use that term all over the place in climate change discussions, in civil rights judgment, wokeism, take your pick. That power word, the magic word is dignity. So if we're all saying there is no distinctions, there's only these just predications of difference across the place, and in every participation, there's just as much as you as in me. I'm bringing this up because I remember Zizek brought it up in terms of like Zen Buddhism talking about the metaphysics of like a soldier knifing another an enemy. Oh no, you're one with the knife. There is no other. It's just matter going through other matter. There's no understanding of a category of dignity and violence acting upon another. I'm just pointing out, like, we have to answer this because if we don't answer this, we really have no right to make any statements that there's murder, that there's rape, that there's any except for some nominal argument of law, that by the nature of convention, we have agreements that we exist in this law. There are consequences by force to say if you do certain things, there are consequences. But in terms of any real force of necessity, which, by the way, I with a note comment, we should be trembling if we accept these predications of what we're talking about. Because if God can basically wipe our form instantly, he can just say, nope, you're not a snake anymore, you're a snake. Yeah, you're a human being. Guess what? You're a cockroach. Boom. So when Kafka does his metamorphosis discussion, that's literally not just our literary activity of just like, well, what if? No, if we're agreeing this is actually how God works in the world, a kind of occasionalism, where there is absolutely no authority of our eidos, our form, to justify itself in existence, then it could be obliterated and changed in any moment, at any given second. Likewise, we can go even further. We can make the argument that all the things necessary for us to exist, water boiling at a certain temperatures, that the air molecules are a certain proportion of different elements and compounds together, that fire burns in the way it does as an exothermal combustion. God can go, nope, I don't think so, and just turn it all at his own whim. So this is where like the trembling of existence should come in if we work through this. That's one side of it. And then the other side is, I'm making very strong, spicy statements. I'm just saying, like, I'm sitting here with these questions, and I'm like, if we don't have an answer to this, then the implications on ethics and law are basically like, it's all power games, and you absolutely have no foundations to justify it. Besides, quite frankly, if you're not going to use law, you're going to, of the secular nature, you're going to say God said don't do it. That's it. So I can be persuaded out of this. I'm just pointing out these are my concerns, but I'm not hearing any strong argument here on where we're challenging the question of substances as ousia, right? Basically, things that are of themselves have a dignity to exist. So I'm just summarizing my concern, and I'm going to throw it back to the group to share, to talk about it.
There is this strange sort of, well, I think the common denominator issue is what's so interesting, right? Like, if there's always the maintaining of a common denominator in order to recognize a miracle as a miracle, then that common denominator cannot of itself be different. Or funny enough, then a miracle is not even a miracle. Like, it vanishes, right? Because you don't have the shared intelligibility to even recognize it. So it is interesting to think that difference can only be difference if it honors substance or if it honors something constant. But then the question would be emphasis, right? Do you want to say God is different, like Javier is trying to be spicy? Or do we want to say that difference is something that requires some sort of shared substance to even be recognized as such? So P does not equal MP. I can concur with this. So Mr. Fishman, Javier Rivera, and then Mr. Stanley.
Man, getting right to the heart of the issue here. Like, what is our foundation of ethics, right? Is a good question. And like, I think that, okay, I mean, you have to recognize an underlying unity to all reality just by virtue of the fact that we can communicate with each other, right? So if the thing is only itself, then there's no way for it to communicate with anything else. And so there's you and me, and then there's the fundamental ground, like you guys are talking about, the home ground in which we can communicate, right? And I think that pretty much every philosophical or theological, ontological system has arrived at that conclusion, right? Whether it's the Platonic one or the Hindu Brahman, right? Or the Tao, or like whatever, there's some fundamental ground to our existence. I think that the Jewish revolution, which obviously the Christians and Muslims picked up on, is to say that ground of reality cares about you, and you can have a personal relationship with that ground of reality, and that ground of reality has a particular desire for creation, right? That things are not like God has the power to change anything, but has allowed things to be different, right? And going back to this idea of like the honesty of war, right? Very Greek idea. The strong will do what they can, and the weak will suffer what they must. And that's like, whoever wins the war, that's whose side the gods were on, kind of by definition, right? But again, the Jews have this revolutionary idea that the highest authority sided with Abel, right? Not Cain. Cain killed Abel, and God allowed him to do it, but God was on Abel's side, which is a completely like, if you think that the powers that be demonstrate themselves, like are in control, then like, why didn't he just stop it, right? And so I think that, like, Thomas, you're saying either it's just power games, or God had, you said God said it, and like, you know, I question the authority of the Torah and certainly of the Christian and Muslim scriptures, but I do think that like unless we frame it as like what does God want, then you're right. Then it is just power games. You know what I mean? I don't see another alternative, because like you can say things have a fundamental dignity, but I think you also have to recognize that things are given their reality by something else. You know what I mean? Because everything is created. Like you can't say the chair didn't create itself, right? And so there is some overarching power. I don't know if any of this is making sense. I feel like I'm rambling.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I'll pass it off. Yeah, what's very interesting to me is every theological tradition has had to deal with this very interesting problem of saying that God is God, therefore there's some sort of ultimacy to God. He's not bound by creation, but then that doesn't mean creation can arbitrarily change, right? There's this real tension here that actually, in all honesty, I always feel like a lot of the problems of modern philosophy are things that theology has talked about, like all this language about process and event, the event. You were speaking about Badu. Theologians have been talking about this crap forever. But since we, don't read theology, I guess we don't know that. Like in Christianity, for example, the notion that if God becomes man in the incarnation, he has a commitment to creatureliness, right? So he's not going to arbitrarily change this. And like you say, like in God and Judaism, he like wants the creation, or there's a certain love, and my screen could have froze. And so therefore there's a kind of commitment. So every tradition has this kind of issue of how do we say that God is not limited by creation, but he's simultaneously somehow committed to creation, right? And that's where you have this tension. And I think a lot of modern philosophy is trying to do something similar. Deleuze tries to do it with sort of an essential difference, but then you can arguably have a flat ontology. Then you have in Badu language of process and event, where the event is the unfailing that things can change, but then it all becomes interesting. But I think this problem is quite severe, but a lot of modern philosophy, I don't feel they're like approaching it, but they may not know that there are traditions that have taken it seriously for a very long time. But let me give it to Javier and then Mr. Stanley.
Yeah, I think Jockin like clarified it for me. So I'm working within the context of love. Actually, Badu, what you're raising, Jockin, is the political realm. And this is what Badu actually cuts off from love. Like ethics and everything, that has nothing to do with love for Badu. Like it's all about controlling the violence, like maintaining a distance on violence. So, but you know what? Because I'm a man of irony, I actually enjoy this predicament. I'm going to still say God is different, and then we maintain that exact order. Like to me, that's my violent love. Like, yes, God is different, but because I love and it's violent, I'm going to maintain the violence at a distance at the same time. Like I like being ironic like that, and paradoxical. Like to me, that's my spicy take in response.
I wanted to ask Thomas, like, even if you could get to this idea of dignity, like, why does it imply ethics? Like, I don't know why, if something has otherness, why that otherness is even worth respecting. I mean, like, I have interests. Like, what if they're otherness, like how the AI, like how people have tried to get AIs to admit that it's okay to kill, like, or to like use a trans person's incorrect pronoun in order to save 500 people, and the AI like won't admit that that's like a possibility, that you could do that morally, like in that situation, just use the wrong pronoun, but it's like, so like, but is there like does dignity exist such that you would have to be committed to respecting that difference, even to the point of letting the 500 people die? Like, just, I don't know how difference gets you to like that dignity should be respected even.
I mean, Matthew, yeah, this is the conundrums we're running into. I'm going to challenge Javier. So I know you're saying like I understand from your framework you're saying ethics doesn't have a game to play on this dance, because you're talking about love as the containment. Basically, I'm a little challenging about this because how best to put this? I'm trying to think of the best way to frame this up on both points at the same time. The reality is we're acting upon the world at every single moment, right? So we're in our bodies and in our realities, we're interacting. We are acted and acted upon. We're doing both, right? This is one of the, like the point on past 10. We're doing that at all times. There are certain things, for example, like I'm sitting on a chair. I'm acting upon the chair. Is this violence? No, because one would argue a chair was made for this. And that's its purpose. Its purpose was to be done. I'm not doing anything contrary to it. Versus I take the chair and I smash it. I'm acting upon it in a way that it no longer has, not only it fulfills its role, it also doesn't exist anymore because it lost its form. Literally, its shape got destroyed by me smashing it, for example. So one acting upon is considered completely normal and not even worth discussion. It doesn't even enter the domain of even awareness. This is kind of like a Heideggerian kind of broken tool discussion a little bit here, right? We use the tool and interfaces with our reality as a protocol or an affordance, but it doesn't really do anything with us. Versus when we act upon in a way that is brokenness and we notice it. It's an obvious, which brings up a point of difference or otherness. And that's the thing. I'm still kind of I'm struggling here because we're switching our language too of using other versus difference. Most we're taking difference. But my original point was, where is our discussion of other? Where is the other? Is that even, have we just obliterated it completely? Because I would say probably what is this idea of dignity? Again, I'm pointing out that people, I don't want to use that term because I think that's a modern invention from ancient Rome that was purely social honor-based from the get-go. That's what it was. My argument is that got co-opted into modern society where we destroyed older metaphysics to justify, to kind of do the work that old school justice used to do. In terms of the ontological existence of things, had a justice, had a way that we ought to live and ought to exist. We use dignity now to try to do the same work. I don't think it pulls it off for the reasons like, this is a fight I don't want to fight because it's not my fight. I'm pointing out that like, I don't think it works, but we see it all over the place because as Daniel said, there's been a lot of great work in theology and old school metaphysics on these questions, but it all gets jettisoned out and we think we can swap it out for dignity and call it a day, but it doesn't work. As you're pointing out, like reasons, it just seems like reasons like this. But I'm using it only to point out what is it trying to do is something I think is very important. It's giving us some mapping of understanding is which acting and acting upons, how should we act and how should we relate to each other? Because that's the thing too. Also, the big thing too is, I mean, normally, like in the ethics or in political science, this normal discussion since Machiavelli has been, we don't want to kill each other. That's literally the purpose of politics, is to stop each other from killing each other. That's basically, so this is why it's interesting, Javier, note about containing violence. I'm a little nervous about that, to be honest, because I would use the Aquinas definition of love, which is wishing the good of the other, or even the Aristotle account, the wishing of the good of the other, which has nothing to do with violence in any sense. That containing of violence that's a more modern argument. I'm challenging you. You can challenge me on this point, totally. I'm not a Bidou reader, so you can totally talk me out of this. I'm just saying, like, it's an interesting framing I'm hearing about this. And I say that because if we use that old school version of what love is, then that's a question of doing the good, wishing the good of the other and doing acts for that person. And again, which leads to our original discussion from the beginning of this point. But this is all places to point out, I don't have a fight. This is not my fight to talk about dignity, dog. It ain't my fight. I think that term sucks because it doesn't think it does the job and it's trying to think its thinking is doing. I think it's flawed in many dimensions, but it's still pointing out this serious chasm of how we act and act upon the world with ourselves, let alone other people and things like that, which then leads to a issue of this domain of love or how it relates to it, let alone these other discussions about theological accounts of like what gives existence. That's the point, that this all kind of circles back to this question of basically substance, because that's what this is all predicating on. No, I'm going to stop with that. Now I'm going to read the comments I was narrating.
No, that was outstanding. I'll give it to Mr. Fishman, Javier, and then Sam. Yeah, the Theory of Justice by John Rawls that conflated justice and fairness has ruined everything, basically. I have a lot to say on that, but that justice is not fairness. And that is the paradigm by which we operate, that basically modern thought needed to get rid of classical ethics, which would inevitably lead you to Aristotle. But we don't like that, so it gets us, so we have a lot of trouble. And also, there's something very interesting here. And everything you said makes me think of your talk with Niebenhauser, Dr. Niebenhauser on Aristotle and Heidegger, which I think is basically putting the finger on it. And then, to me, the big discussion becomes Hegel versus Heidegger versus Deleuze, and that also gets into Aristotle and different things. Now, I'm just pointing to a lot of things because I'm a jerk. Also, there's a problem with this conflation. I agree with you on the conflations of the terms difference and other. Because there's always a problem. If I can recognize something as different, that means it's similar enough for me to make it intelligible. So it is not totally different. Something that is totally different cannot be recognized as different, and therefore is not different. It's actually all that is relative to itself, and thus enters sameness again within its own domain. So there's always a weirdness where difference only makes sense if there's enough similarity to make it intelligible as different, and thus other is never totally other. And so what is this event that Baudrillard, that all these modern philosophies are talking about, this event that kind of breaks through? Like, when you talk about theology, it kind of makes sense, because you're talking about, like Stanley was doing on Call Bart, where like God is entirely giving himself over by his own grace and action, but there's a kind of consciousness, there's a kind of being here that is engaging in that activity. But when you start talking about this metaphysical event in, say, a Quentin, I can never say his name, with after finitude, et cetera, so forth, it becomes fuzzy to me. But that would be a lot. But let me give it to, I can never say that dude's name. Mr. Fishman, Javier, Sam, and Mr. Jockin.
Okay, so first I want to pick up quickly on what Javier was saying about how God is difference, and I think this relates to what Thomas was saying as well. That, like, I mean, the Jewish notion is that God is one, right? And so that would mean that everything is, it's all the same, right? But we are many, and so in that sense, God is fundamentally different, right? And so it's this weird tension where it's like God is different because he is all encompassing, and we are not. We are limited, right? And so that creates the difference and the oneness, and there's kind of this paradox to it, right? And so I guess, like, what I would ask Thomas is, like, you said the chair has a certain purpose, which is to be sat on. And so when I act upon the chair by sitting on it, I'm not committing an act of violence. But if I were to smash it, that would be an act of violence, right? I guess the question, though, is, like, why should I care, right? And this is what Matthew wrote in the chat, is like, what about the tree that you had to cut down to make the chair, right? Because to create something, you have to destroy something usually. And I would say always, unless you're creating something from nothing, which we don't seem to have the ability to do, you must take something and act upon it so that it is something else and no longer fulfills its original purpose, right? And so, like, why should I care? You know what I mean? And, like, presumably when some, like, I don't see how this gets you out of your problem, because I see your problem. What you're saying is, like, why should I say that killing a serial killer is a good thing, but killing a nice church lady is a bad thing, right? And, like, I just don't see how this idea of like, you don't want to call it dignity, but some sort of, like, purpose. I don't know what you're proposing. I guess you're not really proposing. You're just kind of, like, trying to get an answer, but I don't see one other than to relate to the whole somehow, right? Like, in the same way that, if my dead skin cells fall off, that's okay because it's serving the whole of me, right? But, like, if other cells that are vital to me die, that's bad because that's vital to me, right? But me is the whole, and so there's got to be some relationship to the whole by which to discern what destruction is good and what destruction is bad. And so that would be my question to Thomas and the group.
That's an excellent question, and I'll give it to Javier, but Mr. Jockin, that's an excellent question. It does make me think so much about your talk with Dr. Niebenhauser. For me, that alludes to the question that Mr. Stanley and Zaruba and Javier, between the difference in Heidegger between wine and lumber. Like the difference between turning things into standing reserve and the difference between making grapes into the wine in which their being comes forth. This is very mysterious. I do think that's a fantastic question, but let me give it to Javier and then Sam and then Mr. Jockin.
I mean, it's, like, funny, right? Because I enjoy this, like, paradox for me. Like, Christianity says something like, love fulfills the law. How does that happen? How does love fulfill the law? Like, if you look at Romans, right? Paul's going on this whole tirade about, hey, man, I want to do good, but I can't. Like, I just really can't do good, man. Like, as much as I desire it, I always do something bad. And then yet, somehow love fulfills the law. So like, to me, I think this is the tension that like Jockin is bringing up here. But to me, like, this is why I enjoy this exact paradox. Like, when Christianity says that love fulfills the law, like, it almost makes no sense, right? Because when we start thinking about it, we're like, wait a second, you're telling me to love my neighbor fulfills the law? But wait a second, Lacan's interpretation of this is really interesting. The way that we love each other is the way that we hate ourselves, basically, right? So this is why I have a problem with the Thomas Aquinas statement, because people have this tendency to be like, oh no, but I am wishing you the best. And yet they ignore everything what is being said, right? Because somehow, for some reason, it got translated into, I know better what you want. Because I am doing this for you. And so I then care for you. And so like, I know Thomas Aquinas probably doesn't mean it that way, but the problem is, and this is why love your neighbor obligation is such a problematic statement, is because it basically says the same thing, but it's been radically misinterpreted and misunderstood for so long that I can no longer accept that kind of like definition of love. So I have to say something like similar to Lacan, where he says love is the one thing not offered. And to me, ethics, that's why love to me cannot be reducible to ethics, because love is the one thing not offered. It is just the one thing that's not there. Because we're all trying to exchange something. Like ethics is a problem of exchange and the problem of the many. How do we maintain equality? How do we maintain all this other stuff? Like something has to be exchanged. I don't reduce love to this kind of exchange. To me, like the moment you put love in the ethical realm, it becomes a self-relating negativity, right? Because then it's like, this is why it has to be in the context of two and not many, because in the context of two, if you put ethics, the other person can be like, well, I'm not going to forgive you until you do this. I'm not going to do this until you do this. And they can just keep extending that line. And it just keeps going on and on. And for them, that's the ethics of the relationship, right? Like the ethics get sort of built in. But you see, that to me, that becomes instantly problematic. And so like, it can't be reduced to the ethics. Love has to be that kind of like the one thing that's not offered. And yeah, so I don't know if that.
I'll pass it to Ms. Willman, but first off, I get paradox highs too. There's nothing like the high you get off paradox. It's pretty great. You know, it's a good thrill. Ms. Willman.
I wanted to first off kind of talk about the discussion rather than in the discussion. And I wanted to say that firstly, love the spiciness. I like on these net sessions when there's a bit of disagreement, because then you get tension, like a little bit of friction, and really test things out. So I think this is good. Secondly, I feel really like outside of my territory right now speaking on this topic, but it's not something that I don't think about. Just like obviously for one's own life, you're going to think about these things. Okay, so that's my preface. And then I will start by saying, as soon as we get into statements or like proclamations of like God is XYZ, I feel like we're really stumbling on wherefore we cannot speak territory, you know, therefore one must remain silent. And so, but just like taking in everything that was said, a lot, I had a lot of things come up maybe to bring into the conversation, like Javier, when you were talking about how like God is difference, what it reminded me of is this, there's this wonderful text online. It's there's like a religious group in New York, like the Way of the Rose. Basically, Our Lady of Woodstock was an apparition of the lady and of the, you know, of the divine feminine of Mary. Anyways, there's this text online, which is what the message that she brought in during her like when she appeared. And she talks about being the great mother, like being being like everything that exists. She's not like, she's inviolable. She's a virgin because nothing can violate her. You know, like dirt can't make her dirty because dirt is of her. You know, like when you get dirt on you, it makes you dirty because you're not dirty. Like it's something else upon you, but she can't be violated. And it made me think of like, you know, we're talking about God, but like all traditions have a sort of echelon of like an anatomy of like, of these, of like, I don't know, this like anatomy of cosmos. And often like there is a defined feminine, which is sort of like an intermediary between existence and God, which is like more than existence. And after I had these sort of thoughts about Our Lady, then I thought again about this episode of like the Dark Horse podcast. Anyways, they were talking about evolution as they want to do. And I don't know why, but like they were like, oh, I don't know if this is preferable to it not being this way. And it kind of made me think like, one of the things that I find really I don't like about materialism is the fact that materialism never really has a good argument. It has a way of thinking about why existence would be preferable to non-existence at all. Just like pure, like no Big Bang, like, you know, like if you're a materialist, like it's sort of inconsequential. But if you're not, then it is very consequential. Like, why does it matter? And so, yeah, it kind of made me think like we talked earlier about the common denominator between like the rod and the snake. One is dead, a dead tree, you know, once was living, one's a currently living snake. And it made me think of what Michelle had said earlier about Jesus being sort of reckless, and which also made me think of Socrates. Like he knew when it was his day to die, right? And speak, we must remain silent. There is a big difference between thinking and knowing. You know, when you know, you don't need to think because you know. And Socrates knew that he needed to die. Again, the question of ethics, I feel like what we've been talking about is really a lot of the issues that we've been hashing out here, I think are contained in Fear and Trembling by Kierkegaard. And like, I really recommend that text. It's probably one of like the top things I've read, but at the beginning, for those who aren't familiar, like he goes through these different vignettes, like over like all these repetitive different like first person vignettes of like Abraham going to kill Isaac. And I think that's a good example of one of those things where it was not ethical, but through faith and through knowing God, it was right. And it like, but it was terrible, you know? But I think like, that doesn't mean that like, oh, we're just gonna kick ethics in the can. Because I mean, how would you be able to relate to anybody otherwise, right?
Well, it's interesting because what you're saying is like, to go to Michelle's example, it seems like we need to hold ethics and things like you have the grip, you have the nothing, and then you have the open hand with the bird, right? And what Kierkegaard is sort of unveiling is that if you believe in God, you have to follow the ethical, otherwise it's chaos. You have to treat a stick like it's a stick, but you always realize that there's the possibility of God turning it into a snake, per se. Like you hold reality as things, but always realizing that things don't have the ultimate say, except within, say, God's permissive will, right? But then that opens all these different questions. And Fear and Trembling is a magnificent text. And I like spice as well. I'm considering Javier as paprika today. I think it's lovely. Let me give it to Mr. Jockin and then Mr. Javier.
If Javier's paprika, then what am I? Jalapeno?
What, garlic salt? Do you like garlic salt? Is that a good? I like garlic
wow,
salt.
that's
That
not
goes
saying
on.
much. That's an
No, garlic
insult.
salt goes on everything. That's like grace. It's like the least will be first. Like garlic salt is common, but it's
Paprika
like
at least got a little heat to it. I wanted some heat on this.
Okay,
Come on.
Carolina Reaper. How about Carolina Reaper seeds?
I mean, I'm not that spicy. It's not that
it will
bad.
kill you. I have a neighbor that they're terrible. So Carolina Reaper.
But with that said, I think Sam's closing note on bringing up, right, Fear and Trembling and this exact point on Abraham is fantastic. It is fantastic because remember, the big caveat, everything you're saying is correct. Next step. But it was not fulfilled. The violence was not fulfilled. The swapping occurred at the last minute. So I want to point that out. So I think that's actually a quite powerful kind of package when you take that story all together. Now, I'll use that as a great way to reply. I was riffing, so I didn't see the comments. I apologize. I could have answered in the first cycle. First, Javier, thank you for clarifying. I apologize. I misunderstood you where the violence containment question was. I apologize for that. So thank you for clarifying. Yeah, I would agree. That's a very modern mode of ethics. Basically, it's just a question of how do we contain violence against each other. That's basically, I think, a modern argument of what ethics comes down to. I think your question about love being failed is actually tied to the very beginning to the discussion of the false idol of the self. 100%. Your acts of trying to love a neighbor is just your self-love of yourself. In fact, that's why most of actually, I've had many discussions on people. When you're basically trying to do good things to go to heaven, I think that's God giving you a trick. One talk about a spicy take. I'll give you a hot one. I think it's a trap door. I think it's basically God going, nope, you're just doing it for your fucking self. Fuck you. You're not doing it for me. You're doing it for you. That's bullshit. It's similar to also, I actually remember a very spicy moment with my parents when they made a comment once to me about, we gave birth to you for your own good. I looked at them and was like, what are you talking about? You did it for you. You didn't do it for me. You did it for you. Now, from a very classical point of view, they gave me existence, so that's a gift. Plus, I'll grant them that. However, on the subjective level of their own identity and reason they did shit, trust me, I didn't exist yet. So trust me, it didn't do it for me. God knew me, not them. That came later. Again, that's my spicy stuff at the moment. So I see this. So I think the failure of the Aquinas Aristotelian virtue mode of friendship, which is love, is because of our false idol self, which, by the way, is just rampant in our modern contemporary view of psychology, of self-love. It's just the disaster train wreck. I think there's no hope. I think prior relationships had at least the force of necessity of material existence. Like we needed each other to survive. And quite frankly, most relationships were held together by the force of necessity on the outside. Just like most human beings are actually viceful and need law put on them to actually allow society to exist at all. Again, more spicy takes from me. So that's just a note about that love ethics discussion. I will say one thing. Now, Matthew said as a kind of spice take of saying shitty gifts. I actually do think I agree with you. The economy of exchange, it totally sucks. It's just a mercantile. That's literally friendships of utility or pleasure. That sucks. That is absolutely not the friendship of virtue, which is a gift. So I actually hate that book, The Gift. I think it's not well written, but its idea is fantastic because I think it's true. It gets picked up by Marxists as like the excess of the item. It's like just the labor time of like the sweat labor from foreigners and all this other stuff. But I think the reality of the gift of something that's more than what it is. It's not. And in fact, it's almost when if you collapse a gift into just an exchange, a material exchange of how much money it costs you or something like that, it actually kills it. It actually is no longer a gift. And it breaks the properties of what a gift actually is. And actually, one would argue, actually tied to Zachary's comment about art ideally is supposed to be a gift. It's supposed to be this thing that actually activates more than what it is. A piece of art is not just a bunch of pigment on a canvas. Who gives a shit? I mean, that's just a poster. Okay, congratulations. You just did a bunch of pigment on a paper. And art is supposed to do more than that. It's supposed to activate something more. And one could argue the minimum subjectively in the person of viewing it. One could go more extreme and say in reality itself. That's the two separate issues. So I just want to point that out. As I like to see everyone's thoughts about that. One other note, obviously, we brought up the question of the tree. See, this is one of the problems, of course. Again, I want to repeat again. I'm not the one making arguments of dignity actually being legit. I think it's bullshit. I'm just saying that you end up, the minute you say your argument, okay, why is a tree not dignity? Why are you allowed to cut it down? I can't make an argument for it. And this is what it is. I'll say two notes. One is just like we said, I think it was either Zachary or Matthew, I forgot who, someone said like your skin cells, right? Your body is constantly cycling through material all the time. Your material reality is just a flow. Totally agree. There is no crying over your brain cells switching. Who cares? It's your form that matters. It's in fact, one of the arguments, we're not embodied existences The classical view is we're ensouled. Our soul, the essential soul form or soul, is what gives our bodies their existence. Thus, why your arm getting cut off matters, because it's not the material of the arm that mattered. It actually was the form that got cut off. That's what actually was in question here. That's what the violence was on. That's why I bring this up. That's one part of the equation. The other part of the equation, and I actually do think there's some serious mysteries here that I actually don't, there's parts you have to really work it through. So there are realities that are only possible by us in conversation right now, for example, like the act of the intellect for us talking through and having dialogue together. These are things we cannot do by ourselves. We have to be in communing with each other to do this. I bring this up. So, and also if you make the argument of a chain of being, that basically the way they put it is, why is the tree okay, or giving permission to be cut down? It's because it's being put in a more preferred mode of existence. But the only way that works is if you have a great chain of being argument that the rock actually doesn't want to be a goddamn rock, or it's like, if given the opportunity, we love the opportunity to be a house, to be the wall of a house versus just being a bunch of pebbles on the sand. I'm just saying, like, that would be the classical argument of why certain acts of change, which is really what's being argued here by what being discussed, why is some change permissible or like excitable or preferred versus others. Probably the argument would be on the argument of the great chain of being, that a pebble, if given an opportunity to be a stone of a wall, would be fantastic. Or even, quite frankly, animals being killed to be consumed by man so that we continue to exist and we can activate our intellect because we're more real. So obviously, and by the way, this gets actually really dangerous. I want to point out, actually, this argument actually gets very dangerous because if the essential quality of man is our intellect, the act of the intellect, which is what the angels also have. Angels have this and God has this too. If we can create basically AI that actually has general intelligence, and we're not needed anymore. And actually, we should be ecstatic this is happening because we're activating the chain of being even better with a real an actual existence of intellect that is superior to us in every way. Just saying. So I'm saying this out loud, knowing very well the dangers of this argument. You have to then caveat it 1,000 directions, different things. But the basic argument is to kind of summarize this question. What is exactly the violence on? It's not on material matter. It's on essential form. That's what would be the first statement. The second part is why certain things materially allowed to be acted upon and changed versus others is because the argument classically would be because they're going to participate in a higher level of being. That's basically the argument. Those are the two stack arguments. At least I'm presenting it to you. Now, back to Zachary's point, which I'm saying I'm not defending dignity. I don't care about it. I don't give a shit. I have to point that my point is that I do have some commitment to substance. What that is what my original point was. We need to clarify what difference versus other is, because that's the only way we can, I think, parse this out in any way that's in close to coherent. Do I have an answer to that? Absolutely fucking not. I'm pointing out more of the problems with it than any solutions. I'm very aware of that. But that's where I'm at right now. And I'm going to stop there.
That was beautiful. I'm going to Javier, Sam, and Mr. Fishman. And I didn't think we needed the great chain of being. All we needed was Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree, and that's why we can make trees into chairs. That was the way I was going. I thought Shel Silverstein took care of that. And don't worry about talking about the AI apocalypse. We've already alluded to antinatalism and Beast Titan, so I think we are all fine. But actually it actually is ultimately interesting to consider things like antinatalism. And I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when you told your parents, no, I do not owe you because you were born me. No, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that one. That would have been beautiful. My network bandwidth is dying. We'll see how much more we can go. Javier, please. Luckily, substance isn't a big deal either. It hasn't been in all of philosophy forever. So I'm glad about that one. Javier.
Well, I mean, I really did enjoy Sam's take because I think it kind of hit on like what I mean by difference a little bit, because it's like, I don't think, and at least this is like my Derridian side coming out, where it's like, I don't think difference is that obvious. Like, I think if I were to push further, I would say difference is like difference, mysterious tremendum. Like, what is it that I'm trembling about? Like that kind of difference. Like, what is it what is this difference that puts me at the edge of my being? What is this difference that puts me on anxiety and so on? And yet when we talk about love and that emergence of the two scene, like Badou likes to talk about, there is something like anxiety provoking about that whole thing. Because we have this tendency to want to oscillate back to the one, me and my identity. Like we want to go back. But to go on one of my readings for like, you know, one of my favorite things, so I think, who is it brought it up? Was it Zachary or was it Matt? Where it was like to do something, no, I think it was you, Jockin, where it's like to do something is sort of like to earn your way to heaven is sort of like the trap, right? Like it's like the biggest trap. Well, this is why I like Kierkegaard, right? Where it's like, you know, one of my favorite, like when I used to be Muslim, one of my favorite arguments that like I used to hear would be like, why do you have to not eat, like, why are you banned from eating pork? Like, it literally makes no sense. Literally makes no sense for like the atheists and so on, right? Muslims like have a bunch of these like wonderful explanations about the pig being dirty and so on, and it's great, right? But here's like the kicker that I really enjoy. When someone like asks me, why are you doing it? Because it rationally doesn't make any sense. I do it because I can't do it. That's my irony in it all. I'm doing it because I can't do it, you know? And I feel like that kind of nullifies, maybe not explicitly nullifies, I don't know. I mean, this is like an actual like identity issue with your own attention with your identity. But this idea of like, this is why I almost hate when like, one, atheists always like reduce religion to morality, which I always hated. And then the people that also perpetuate religion also reduce it to morality, and I also hate that. Because I'm like, there's aesthetics, there's so much more than the reduction of its morality and its issues. But what I've always enjoyed is that exact take of like, you know, I'm doing this fasting, I'm trying to do this, and I explicitly know that I'm going to fail at it. I can't do it, but I continue to do it anyways. And this is why I like to say that love is the one thing not offered, because it's like, it just implies that implicit failing of just like, I'm doing it because I love you. I don't know why else I'm doing it, because I literally can't do it. You know? And it's like the realm that maybe this is a spicy take. I don't really know, but I really like getting the raised eyebrows when it's like, why are you doing this? Because I can't do it. That's why I'm doing it.
Should I go?
Yeah, my internet's dying now. Spicy take, internet dying. Javier. Yeah, raised eyebrow high too. That goes with the paradox high. So that's good as well. Sam, please.
I just wanted, sorry, I know we're talking about bacon now. But I wanted to take it back to what Thomas was saying about the great chain of being. Why would a tree consent to become a chair, or, you know, if it can consent, anyways. But I really like this line of thinking, because then for me, it gets to like under that framework, architecture can have an ethical dimension. You know, under an atheistic, I guess, like, yeah, materialism, like it's just shelter, right? But I, you know, and I think this frame of thinking produces really good architects. Like you have Kahn, he was asking what a brick wants. Like, what does a brick want? A brick wants compression. You know, it wants an arch. It doesn't want trabeated architecture, you know? And then you have like Claudio Silvestrin, and he's asking things like, how do you create architecture as like bringing space for beauty in participation with Earth, you know, which is a different question than like, how do I design something beautiful? And I mean, he's a profoundly religious architect, and he's very critical of the profanity of contemporary architecture, that it doesn't allow space for God. It's just, we're just building spaces for man. And I think, yeah, I agree with you, Javier, that I do dislike that atheists tend to reduce religions to morality, but then it's kind of like, with those like broader cosmological frameworks, you can think ethics, I think, much more deeply.
I guess I'm a little shocked that y'all didn't think the God delusion was a knockout punch. I mean, it had that amazing argument that we don't know who made God that no theologian addressed before the beginning of the 1st century. So I don't know about you guys. I thought it was a knockout punch. But Mr. Fishman, please.
Well, just first I want to pick up on what Javier is saying about how like the prohibition to eat pork doesn't really have any like obvious ethical reason for it, right? And you can justify it by saying pigs are dirty and, you know, trichinosis and all that. But the Jewish or a Jewish take would be to say that like it's simply that God doesn't like it. You know what I mean? It's like you can imagine if like, I don't know, say you're married to somebody and you pick your nose and eat your boogers in bed, right? And your wife says to you, stop that. And you say, why? Like there's no, you know, it's good protein, right? There's no like ethical reason not to do that. But she's like, because I don't like it. It grosses me out, right? Stop it. And there's no, like, it's just, I simply don't like it. And that's indicating the relationship that we're supposed to have with God, right? It's like, God says, don't eat pork. What do you mean, why don't eat pork? God doesn't like it, so don't do it, right? Which is also, of course, the danger. And like, you know, that's the dogmatism. And then, you know, there's ways that can go wrong, but that is ultimately the point that's being made there, I think, is that it is in relationship to what God wants, or to whatever your ultimate thing is, right? Because like Thomas, what you're saying about how like the morality comes in preservation of the form, which that's what I was trying to get at. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear with that, but like, you know, that's what I'm saying, is that the skin cells that slough off don't matter because they don't threaten I wouldn't say form, I would say more like purpose or something, but same, you know, I mean, there's like an overarching unity which is not threatened by the sloughing off of skin cells, but is threatened by the cutting off of an arm or the puncturing of a heart, right? And so I guess my point here with morality is that like once you come to competing interests, like this is where the chain of being thing falls apart. Is like the chicken does not want to be my dinner. You know what I mean? Like anybody who's ever hunted or killed anything knows that like that argument to me is just a non-starter. It's like the food, you know, plants and animals do not want to be my food. I must go against their wishes in order to make them my food. But I feel like I'm justified in doing that because my purpose is more important than their purpose, right? And so like once you get to competing interests, you have to appeal to a higher authority. Like if it's between me and the serial killer, then like whose life is more important? There has to be important to who, begs the question, right? Because you can just say, well, we should respect the form of the serial killer as much as the form of the good person. And so I would maintain that like there has to be an appeal to a higher authority, or you just get power games. I think you said it right at the beginning, Thomas. It's like either God said it or it's just power games all the way down. And that's I don't see a third. Like I don't see a third. You keep saying like, you know, I'm not saying this, but the argument would be X, Y, and Z. And like fair enough. But like, what is the alternative? I'm interested to know. If someone has one, I'd be delighted to hear it. But I don't see one. So that's all I gotta say.
Barn cats. I'm telling you guys, they're magicians. They come out of nowhere. They have the secrets. They are the event. Mr. Jockin and then Sam.
Yeah, I'm gonna wrap up. Guys, fun conversation. It's been a lot of energy. I agree with Sam before sometimes. It's not even disagreement. I'm just pointing out, I just said, hey guys, I'm hearing all this. I'm letting you know there's some consequences that come from this that could be completely disastrous if we don't address this. So I don't know, it's not even a disagreement. It's just seeing the consequence of a certain line of argument and going, guys, we got to answer this somehow. We gotta address
I
this.
appreciated your prodding. It was great. It was fun. We need that. Like
Exactly.
it was bringing up dignity. We were the devil's advocate.
Devil's advocate games for that. Yeah, because I would say on two parts, by the way. So actually, I think, by the way, kind of like what we're getting at here, I think actually kind of on a closing note, in Aristotle, he talks about his metaphysics. When he's push comes to shove, he's like, what is the science of being? Give me, what is it? God damn it, give it to me. It's like you've been playing games with me for 500 pages about what this thing is, and even what substance is. Because by the way, he's confused because sometimes it's primary, it's the material essence of the material substratum, or is it something else? Is it form? Like, bro, what is it? Give it to me. He finally concludes it's unity, which is actually more shocking and kind of terrifying, because what that means then, there's many different kinds of unity. So here we go. And thus, the original pretense on how can the staff become the snake is because there's a unified unity. There's some unity of being. That's what makes it being. It's a unity. But unity can go into crazy things like metaphorical language. When we see liquid capital, for example, or liquid, I mean, we predicate about the water and the capital, they are clearly nothing alike to each other, and yet they are, because they have an intelligibility that the metaphorical statement, analogical statement of liquid covers. That all carries on into the analogical terms for God. When we say God is wisdom and justice and courage and mercy and all these other things that can be predicated of human beings and creation, God is also said to have this. Even better, actually, a high perfection of it. So I'm saying that there's actually more conundrums that are brought up into this in the end. One last note, and actually related to that, actually I tie in with that unity point, because actually one of the arguments, kind of what Sam said about, like, I actually know as an artist too, we absolutely have, when we're not in a kind of like dominating mode with our materials, we're in a conversation with it. I know that sounds a little ridiculous, but it's totally true. I'm actually sitting there, I've had conversations, like not actual conversations, but like a kind of attenuating to the material. The material wants to be a certain way. I mean, we know this, even just most basic point of like wood grain goes in one direction versus another. If I cut this in this one direction, it's going to be shit. If I cut in the other direction, it cooperates with me. It's almost like it's literally the idea of like synergy, right? Cooperation. So it's the idea, we go in certain directions and act on in certain ways. It works well with us. It works nicely, right? It's virtuous with us. It's participatory with us. Other times it will fight and struggle and mess us up. I might even use cooking examples. Like, when you cook a steak, there's a difference between the cutting with the grain and against the grain. It actually helps, like in terms of actually making the food more enjoyable or not, as an example. Other point. So I tie all this in beyond what Sam just said, with one other point I want to close, which is ideally the act of intervention, because that's also what it comes down to here. Like, when does one, which is a kind of a question of ethics too, when does one intervene on existence to do these things? So one area of the angle, I know it was challenged, is about the chain of being argument. I actually, in my own introduction of it, I pointed out it has flaws, it has dangers in it. The other side of it is to make an argument we should act on privations. For example, when people are sick, we act on the sickness, not on the health. Because in actuality, it's actually the body that heals itself. Medicine, all the interventions just remove the privations that got in the way, which is a good old-fashioned metaphysics Aristotle point. Talks about it all the time. Talks about capacities. Substances have natures. That's the first doumasis. The second doumasis is capacity. So when something has a nature to do something, so gaining language or whatever, if something's hindering it, it's blocking, it's a privation blocking its capacity from acting. And what should be acted upon is on the privation, so that existence can actually flourish. That would be the argument. And in fact, the eudaimonia, right, of flourishing for human beings, the project of it is to remove privation so that the human nature can be fulfilled and satisfied. That would be the argument. Now, that gets played out in the particulars. This is all metaphysics all the way through. That's why I agree. It's not just morality, it's metaphysics and ontology and all the other things. And how do you know what things? So all the projects of philosophy have to be answered. My statement doesn't give you much. It all says is maybe some framework to discuss the question of unity, and then the question of where does privation sit next to it. And maybe that, and even then we've talked about this, the language of lacks versus privations, against differences, and against others. I'm still not satisfied. We did not come to a good answer about the difference versus other question, but maybe the discussion of privations versus lack might be a better way to talk, maybe a way to talk about that. But I'm going to stop talking now. It's good talk, guys. Really appreciate
No,
it.
it's excellent. I've enjoyed it very much. And I think as just a note, and then I'll give it to Sam, what you're suggesting is the impossibility of separating ontology, metaphysics, and ethics, which is a modern mistake. And therefore, we've just been like, we thought we could escape that problem by just saying justice equals fairness, and that therefore ethics is a matter of fairness. But of course, that has to assume a certain metaphysical construct. And basically what it is tried to assume is materialism. But I believe that Sam has pointed out quite rightly that materialism cannot justify its own materialisms because, you know, it exists. Why not? It's all accidental ultimately. But let me give it to Miss Willem and then Javier.
Zachary, when you asked, like, can we think of an example where the chicken might want to be our dinner? Like that sort of dynamic really just comes down to like a power and a might, and an authority of might is right, like more or less. I kind of, I don't know that is like, I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the case, although I don't want to be anybody's dinner, but sometimes, you know, Socrates will go willing to his death. And, you know, other times, you know, if you were to take my beloved and threaten his life, like I might offer my own, like, you know, and likewise, I can actually point to examples. Eduardo Cohn, he's a McGill anthropologist, and he studies the language of the Runa people in South America, and he talks about ways like hunting processes where you ask, you contact the animal in dream states prior to hunting, and you ask for their lives, or the Innu people who will go into trance states and ask for the animal master's permission to give up one of his caribou. You know, like, I mean, I don't know how amenable you are to that idea, but like those ideas are out there, and it becomes about your relationship, not about just power.
That is a fascinating comment, and it does make me think about the human. Gosh, there's books on this, like the relation of eating, like Thanksgiving, prayer, gratitude, like rituals of eating. And now, of course, it could all be just humans brainwashing themselves to convince themselves that it's not a bad thing. But it is interesting how there have been cultures that have said, yes, we are going to be, how do we engage in killing animals, but not murdering animals almost, if you wanted to. Now, I'd have to go into that, but that's an interesting thing, because what's the difference between murder and killing? You'd have to get into metaphysics, ontology, and different things. But if you grant me that language here, Javier Rivera, please.
Well, I mean, like you guys have been saying, I mean, theology has addressed these issues. What's the difference between killing and like honoring and sacrificing the sort of animal, so to speak? You know, I've always like, for some reason, modernity only has like modernity only has like two options. It's like, if you eat animals, it's wrong. It's like, but no, well, we need to eat animals. And, you know, and it's like these constant dichotomy or whatever. But to me, religion actually had like a middle take, you know, where it's like the animals were like a mercy of God, you know? So that's why it's not just like this, it's not like, it's like, of course, the animal doesn't want to be eaten, but there is this sense of like mercy in a way. Actually, the Buddha, one of the Buddha kind of like, what's it called? Like, it's like the stories of like the Buddha's life and like his reincarnations, where it's like he came across a hungry like group of like tigers, and he decided to literally just offer himself. And so rationally, it doesn't make any sense, because we're functioning off of this biological paradigm of like, I want to preserve my life, and that's what it is, and that's what I'm reduced to. But, you know, and this is where like the topic of love comes in, where it's like, it always makes no sense. Like, why would you offer yourself? Why would you do it? And then yet they do it, right? Because for some reason, the Buddha felt that these starving cubs mattered more than his life. right? And so he offers himself and he gets consumed. And so, you know, when we hear these stories in modernity, like it literally makes no sense. Which I've always enjoyed the making of like no sense. Because this is where you can literally understand the notion of eternity because time is capturing it. And this is how Badu kind of understands love as well. Like for some reason, eternity goes into time, time sort of like frames it for you, and it's like this kind of encounter, but then you have to spend your life sort of building up and constructing together with this two scene what it is. So yes, I think we've really been going into some deep questions on, you know, ethics and you know, virtue and everything. And it's really just, to me, it's like very mind-numbing stuff. But there's something that Thomas Jockin said about like, this is a very important issue. Like, you know, we have to care about this. So one of my real encounters with difference is when somebody says, I don't care. Like, to me, this is when I know that I am no longer in my little philosophical like paradigm. Is when somebody looks to me like at Walmart and he goes, hey man, I just don't fucking care. And I'm just like, how you know, like it kind of stuns me because I'm like, but you should care because it's really important and it's really metaphysical and it affects our whole reality. And then yet you have this person that's standing right before you and he tells you, I don't fucking care. And it's like, to me, that is the most like the most like blatant philosophical problem to me. Like the fact that somebody could just look at you and be like, hey man, I just don't care. Like, and that's where I almost situate difference and then ethics. Not how the ethics and then different sort of mingling of Daniel's yelling, you know. But I mean, I do have a really funny story, like similar to Jockin with like my own parents, where I was like giving my mom like all these convincing arguments for like Islam at the time, and my mom my mom literally said, "That's nice, honey." Like, that's, you know, like, but it was like the most just it felt like such a deep slap in the face for me, you know, because like I realized that as a human being I was fundamentally helpless in this situation of getting somebody to like care, like, you know, like I think, and I know we all experience this to some degree because we're all philosophically minded. So when we're talking with normal average people that don't engage with these conversations, they're like, what? Like, you don't make any sense, bro, and just shut up. Like, you know. But hey, you know, yeah, I'll leave it there.
I just have this image of you going into Walmart with Badu. It's like, hey, sir, I just need 5 minutes of your time. I gotta tell you about the event. It's like, dude, get off my arm. Get off my arm, kid. All right, Mr. Jockin, please.
Yeah, I think it's very straightforward. I mean, I kind of shrug at that only because, listen, there's things about advanced calculus. You put me in front of that and show me how much that to present, like that's flow dynamics, and that explains about why the nature of water flows the way it does and how, et cetera, like all these things of reality that are acting on me. Same goes for like astrophysics or now thinking about gravity. You can sit here and give me all this. And at one point, I'm like, that's cool, bro. But it doesn't have it. But that's the point. Like, I don't find that really that concerning because most of our lives were acted upon. Like, I think the biggest mistake is actually that I don't mind that. What I do mind is people who don't have the awareness to say, yeah, I don't care about these things. I'm not thinking about these things. I'm okay with the consequences of other people and principles and parts of reality deciding for me what my life is going to be. I actually respect that. If people, and you know, I've had this conversation. People said like, this is just not my problem. You know, if I could just take care of my family, get food on the table for them, enjoy the game on the weekend, that's a good life for me. That's not my problem. Like, that's not like, it's actually arrogant. It would be arrogant of me to go, no, bro, you need to put your soul on the line and get after God. And also kind of, I mean, also that is an example. It really is hubris because, you know, God decides what grace comes. That's it. The fact that we have any interest in caring about this is because of God, not because of us. That I was playing devil advocate games all day, but I'll put my card on the table of my theological accounts or commitments. That's one of them. Our goodness is not our goodness. Our glory is not our glory. It's God's. So any understanding, any small specks of understanding we have or interest in this is not from us. It's from God. So I'm just saying, like, I'm not surprised at all about that colleague and the person in the Walmart, let alone your parent and your mother. I mean, that's a great example. And trust me, like I come from a Muslim family, but it's super normie. And my hot takes are like all like the whole move of like, I do find it very annoying, kind of this kind of normie Islamic account of things where like we have to rationalize the divine law and they have to like do things because you can go to Jannah. I'm like, I told my mother once, like, don't you realize if you're doing it because you want to go to heaven, you kind of fucked yourself? Like, it's kind of a trick. Like, you should be doing this even if you get put to hell. Like, you should be doing these, you should be following the law and doing God's commandments, but laws of the law and love, by the way. It's not just that. The issue of that is just a law question. It's not good enough in Islam. It's also your heart. You have to, ascend means beautifying your soul. And then you just collapse into just do the law by your own will and by your own heart. That's not good enough. It's supposed to be beautified. I always hated that when that kind of Islamic mode of collapsing what is the highest essence of the religious life is just follow the law and do it gleefully. Like, yes, that's part of it, but it's not the only part of it. It's supposed to be much more than that. Anyways, that's just tangent notes. I'm just bringing all this up to say, look at the comments are great. I wish the comments will also be posted on YouTube because they've been fired the whole night. By the way, they've been fantastic. I'm just pointing out like, and I got completely sidetracked now, so I'm just going to close by saying, great conversation. I'm still a little kerfuffled on this neat, like, I'm a little kerfuffled on it too, quite frankly, because like the question of like, what is the other, what is actual other, and what is difference? I actually think it's a legitimate point. I don't have an answer yet, and I'm not really been satisfied with what I'm hearing. I think the work we did on lack was fantastic. The draw out that it's not nothing, it's something clearly something very different, and it's not just the psychological side of it, it's also ontological in nature. We're going to have to do the work. I think we're going to have to do similar work on this question because I don't have an answer, and I feel like I'm very unsatisfied because these kind of questions we're drawing out on the arts, on beauty, by the way. Actually, and by the way, Javi, actually, that's what I wanted to say before I got my tangent note. This is a good old project of rhetoric right here. Basically, the problem is you got to shape your image to the person you're speaking to motivate their soul to the desire, the good or the beautiful or something like that. So that would be that's from reading my Phaedrus. I'm writing the Phaedrus essay right now for my lecture series. And that's exactly the argument that we made there is we need good old fashioned rhetoric for exactly this reason. You cannot just do the project of philosophy of dialectics nonstop and think you're going to get that. You're going to convince most people to move their souls, ideally to the temperate, which, by the way, actually my favorite statement, I'll close on this, was in Plato. He talks about this in Phaedrus. Temperance is not just like shutting down your life. I wish we had rest of the crew here because it kind of had a very Nietzschean mode. It's the desire, the informed opinion, the desire the best. I'd love that. I think it's fantastic. Because anyone from a theological account would totally agree that actually God is the best. And actually most of our problems that we actually love things more than God, which are actually faulty, almost consistently. They're always lacking in some way. God's the actually only that doesn't lack. And if we weren't so foolish to think those other goods are actually better than God, we'd be much better off. Anyways, I'm going to close with that. It's been good.
Well, that was magnificent. I've enjoyed this conversation immensely. What you just asked at the end on the difference between other and difference cannot be overstated in its importance because modern philosophy has conflated those, and it thus, as conflated, becomes in service of ideology preservation. Because, oh, I'm encountering the other when I encounter, say, someone like, so for example, what you see politically, the other is someone who is also a conservative, but maybe they have a different job. And you see, that's not really an other. There's a difference there that then functions to make you believe that you can encounter and deal with otherness, and thus are not just dealing with people in your own confirmation bubble, but actually the difference is in service of a sameness to have an ideology preservation. And in fact, if other is going to be meaningfully distinct from difference, it has to be in some way. Now, you could reverse this. If you want to say capital D difference or whatever, like Deleuze, otherness would have to transform the horizon by which you define same and difference according to. It would have to have some sort of phase shift function going on. Like the encounter with beauty, if it changes the horizon by which you understand the world, there is an otherness there, because it then changes the way things are different. But in modern philosophy, conflating otherness and differenceness, there is no category of an experience that changes what constitutes differentness. So differenceness is always thus sameness in disguise. And when you do that, it becomes ideology preservation. This is a massive mistake of modern philosophy that I'm extremely critical of, and you can't overcome it by simply talking about an event. And I really do not like, personally, the language of event. I know what a lot of these modern philosophers are trying to say, but the moment you talk about events, you have to talk about metaphysics, and they will not do that. They'll kind of mention metaphysics and proceed to not do metaphysics, because ultimately we'll come to questions of substance, and they don't want to do that. A few more things to say. I think what you're saying about love and anxiety, that also hints at why so many of these modern philosophies, when they talk about love, are actually talking about Aristotle's metaphysics, because if you're engaging in virtue, you have to make judgments and thus face anxiety. Like all of what you see in the experience of anxiety is the reason why actually the way that they talk about love is dealing with the problems of judgment, which is going to let you what is fitting, right? Because you have to judge what is fitting, and that is according to what the thing is. So they're trying to do a baited switch, in my opinion. Now, I'm not accusing Badiou or all these other modern people of consciously doing that, but there's this move that's going on that I find problematic, because no one's going to get mad at you for saying love is what counts. Like if you as a philosophist, and in the end, what matters is love, who's going to critique that? It sounds dandy. But if it's actually a bait and switch to kind of suggest we're actually getting back into questions of metaphysics, but don't ask because other and difference is the same, and as long as you love, you're engaging with other and therefore encountering a new event. No, if other and difference are similes and you're just loving something you're calling other that's actually a difference in service of ideology preservation, no. You've done a bait and switch there. That means you're just ideology preservation. You're not having an encounter with otherness that changes the horizon by which you define reality. And so it's a bait and switch, and it's a dangerous one, in my opinion. So another thing that I'm really interested in is barn cats. And then additionally, this point on how, what's very curious to me, and then first, when you brought up this point, how substance is unity. This is where, to say something extremely large at the end, is where you get this problem in Hegel of a monistic dialectic, and also nature and notion are bound. Like if we can think about things, then there has to be enough of a unity in things and the thought of things to make it possible to have a relation to them, to understand them. And then that is constantly recycling through dialectically the understanding of this. And this is where you get into the problem of where nation, and yes, metaphors, very good, where notion and nature go together, which sounds insane, like to say that somehow nature and notion, or that in nature, the intelligibility of nature is possible because it is isomorphically structured like notion or idea. That makes a lot more sense when you start looking at this problem of substance, because there has to be some sort of unity that's going on. Otherwise, like you say, metaphors would not work. And of course, what's so interesting about metaphors is metaphors not only are decorations of thought, they change how you think. And that gets into Lakoff, that gets into Hofstadter and all these different things. So there's something very deep going on. And so you get in Hegel this weird monistic single substance dialectic, basically, is how I understand it, which sounds insane. And it sounds like a paradox. And this is what's interesting to me. So we said earlier that fire is that which cannot burn itself. So you can identify what is fire according to the thing that it lacks, right? It lacks the ability to burn itself, and thus that lack of an ability suggests the substance of fire. It has something to do with burning, right? Precisely because it cannot do it to itself, right? What's really weird is it seems like all of these paradoxical things, like you're talking about love failing, right? Or that you have to hold things with an open hand, right? Or that the human comes out in this moment where the ethical is suspended for the theological, almost as if the human themselves is the unifying principle between those in the decision to figure out how they can go together in the human life, right? There's something about, it's almost as if all of these paradoxical situations are somehow situations where humans find themselves having to do something they cannot do to themselves, like fire trying to burn itself, which thus may be a suggestion of the substance. That the very fact that paradox always seems to be it, you go, yeah, that's love, that's failure, right? The human is the moment they think of something, they lose it. Yes, that's what it means to be human. That right there suggests that the paradoxical situation is somehow a revelation of the substance of what is human, right? And, or could, that would be the avenue to suggest, because the paradox is when the human they attempt the presencing of a lack, which of course you can't presence a lack because then it ceases to be a lack, and yet the effort to presence the lack therefore suggests the human is a being who is capable of trying to preference the lack, and that there is something about the human being fitted in the effort to do that very thing, right? And so the human is fitted in the paradox because that somehow suggests what the substance of the human is. And this is where they're all like, yeah, because humans are like made in the image of God, but they're also fallen. Yeah, they're finite, but they're also infinite somehow. Yeah, they're like a mixture of animal nature, but also spiritual nature. Like all the theologies are often suggesting this weird double mood, right? Even like Korbosky talking about humans as a binding of dimensions. And thus, the substance that you're trying to describe of the human seems to be suggested by this crossover of these dimensions, of which make possible these paradoxical situations that always strangely feel as if they're a revelation of a truth. Like when you say love is this thing that must feel, that love is this thing that must fail, why is it that that feels like it? You go, yes, there's something to that. That is fitting. That is right. Then you try to talk about it and you can't figure it out. Like you get it and then you talk about it, it's like, I don't get it. I don't get it, right? Like that phenomenological experience seems to be a suggestion of the substance. Now I'm just using substance like the unifying principle of what makes the human. And of course, that is a massive question, but I agree with Mr. Jockin that basically that is what you have to ask in order to do ethics, ontology, metaphysics, and so on and so forth. And also, it is interesting, like we're talking about how the human can kill the animal and maybe there's some different situations. It is interesting that if a lion eats a human, we don't put him on trial, right? We don't put a lion on trial. We may shoot it, but we don't put it on trial, which is curious, right? Because you don't really think of a lion as committing murder. You think of it committing like killing, like immoral killing, right? Or something like that. Well, the very apprehension of a difference right there suggests that we are always actually subconsciously operating according to fittedness, even if we can't explain it. Like we just get there's a difference. Like how? Then we do all of our Peter Singer and all of our different things like that, right? And then there's the apprehension as well that, oh, there's something about the paradox that's revelatory of the substance, and we apprehend it, and that's very interesting. And then, of course, the last thing I'll say is the point was made about with theological traditions feeling like they have to rationalize everything they do. Like in Christianity, there was the effort to like show that Genesis is literal, Ken Ham, all the creationism and different things like that. The problem with that effort is that you are actually conceding the ground to modern science. You are saying something is true if it is scientific, therefore we need to make Genesis scientific. So you've actually lost the battle before it began because you've conceded the paradigm of modern science being the way of truth, right? I don't think it's by chance that when you have a zeitgeist that accepts that paradigm, then no one's paying attention to these apprehension moments, because those are apprehensions that suggest that phenomenology suggests the truth. And as we move perhaps away from a mono theory of modern science as being the paradigm of understanding, you're starting to open up questions that are really pointing out why is it there's a certain apprehension there in the experience of paradox, and perhaps exploring that and paying more attention to it can help us deal with this all important problem of substance that Mr. Jockin has brought it out, and that we have all had the pleasure of speaking about on this fine day.
So this is why I think tension is really important, because the phenomenology of tension would help you in some ways discern what we're talking about between otherness, and also like how is this otherness like I think it would, in my opinion, kind of distinguish between otherness as disguised as sameness between like an actual otherness, right? Because what immediately happens when you experience tension is you want to suffocate it. You don't want to deal with it. And it immediately becomes uncomfortable. But also would like to provoke this idea of like, it may not also be immediately apparent about what is causing the tension, right? it may not even be the fact that there is this other human being that is next to you, but there is something there that is other. And that is what's causing the tension. But it may not be like you gave this wonderful example, like it may not be like the Republican and like difference of jobs, right? that may not be that otherness, so to speak. But I do think, you know, one of the biggest problems is that typically we think of unity as like this nice equilibrium, symmetry, and so on. But actually, I mean, this idea of unity as a tension, as a kind of tension between it. And this is why I'm starting to actually like the language of like not two and yet one, so to speak, where it's not a single two, but it's a not two. It's like same body, but not two. Somebody gave the example, not here, but I had read an example of like conjoined twins, where it's a kind of like not two, because you can't say that there are one and they are now two, but it's this weird dynamic where it's like it's a not two, but also not a one. And it makes me go back to that kind of biblical verse of like, when you get married, you become one flesh, right? And people typically associate that as like, now we're a unity and, you know, now we're one. But why is there always tension in marriage? Why is love always riddled with tension? And so it becomes like this not to. So I think, to me, Jockin kind of gave you the doorway to just like think of this unity as like a not to. But I also like playing with Badu's notion of the two scene, where it's like not necessarily about unity, but the fact that you're seeing the tension is in the fact that there is two scenes. That there is two scenes, and yet you are together. You are committed to each other, so you are together. So there is this ironic thing that's happening when we talk even about relationships, where it's funny that we have two eyes and yet we have like this mono vision. Like that really like actually surprises me, that we have two eyes and yet I have a mono vision of the world. But it's only when you are together with somebody else that you begin to see the world in two, that it all of a sudden becomes like two eyes. You know, it's like a real interesting, like, to me, this is like fascinating that I live my life in this mono vision with two eyes, makes no sense to me. And then all of a sudden I get with somebody else and it's like, now you understand the difference of like the two scene, and there's real tension in that. And then yet, like Badu says, it verifies the world for you, ironically enough, that because they're seeing the same sunset that you're seeing. And yeah, I'm gonna stop there because I almost got really sentimental. I was like, and that's really beautiful. That's what immediately came to my head. I was like, that's it. That's all I gotta say.
It was very beautiful, Javier. And I think also it is interesting to think that, yeah, definitely in a relationship, the reality of hermeneutics comes out. And it really does not come out until you're committed to another that you can't leave. Like, if you are around people who interpret things as you interpret them, and you can just say, you guys are dumb and leave, that's one thing. But when you're committed to it, then it brings out something. And then the question would be, is there a revelation in that situation of substance, of what is human substance, right? The other thing I was going to say is, now I'm thinking about attention, like a-attention and attention in Simone Weil, and like, is attention observing of tension and not looking away? I'm thinking of that. Also, I find it very interesting when it says one flesh in the Bible. Typically in the Bible, flesh is the principalities of the age that are problematic. Flesh is sin. And so really, for two to become one flesh can suggest one battle, or one, like, under one paradigm of issues and like principalities they have to conflate. Like, we interpret one flesh as meaning like single entity. But if you think of it like under a single realm of like confiding, like fighting against the flesh, like you are one battle against the flesh, not two battles against the flesh. And then it kind of brings out why there's fighting in marriage. and relationships and Chekhov and all the great writers and different things. So it's always been interesting to me how in that situation, flesh, like in that interpretation of flesh, it means unity and like harmony, when throughout a lot, the Bible or the New Testament, it can mean something more negative, like flesh is negative. So it's interesting, I think, to become one battle against the flesh. Well, then you would know what you're doing. Oh, we're in a fight together against the flesh or the principalities. And by flesh, we're not trying to be Gnostic. We're saying the negative tendencies of the human being, to example, get irritated when the waffles are all eaten. You're in a battle together, so you can't fight your wife over eating the last waffle, right? Because we're in this together. The last thing I will say is it would seem that otherness, if we grant that term, has something to do, like we have a tendency to hide otherness behind a language of difference, or vice versa. This is the language issue, because otherness is like, to tie to the art example with the Rilke poem, otherness is what says you must change your life. Like you must change your life now. And once it says you must change your life, you cannot go back to a world where you didn't hear that you must change your life. So your horizon is changed forever, right? So that's why we like to conflate difference and otherness, because then nothing can come out and says you must change your life, right? Because here's the problem. Once something says to you, you must change your life, well, who am I? How do I do that? And what's virtuous? Oh, crap. I've been thrown into the philosophical, like, shoot, I got to read Aristotle now. And that's hard. That's not easy. So we try to avoid the experience of, of otherness being, you must change your life. And that's why I'm actually quite critical of a lot of the language of event being so much in terms of economics. Like a lot of times when you read these modern philosophy, the event is the revolution that overthrows the economic system or whatever. Well, that's convenient because we know economics and we can be free in communism. It can change anything. No, if the event is an event, it is something that will shatter your paradigm and mean you must change your life. And just because you overthrew tyranny, that doesn't necessarily mean you have been compelled by otherness. I'm not saying tyranny is good. I am saying that in a lot of modern philosophy, there is actually the description of the event in a manner that sounds all powerful and all transformative, but actually, ironically, it is in service of ideology preservation, because true otherness would throw you back into metaphysical considerations, and we don't want to do that because metaphysics is supposed to be dead. So I think otherness is that of which says you must change your life. So I hope everyone today may have an experience of a certain horizon and beauty that says to you, you must change your life, because all lives that change into something more beautiful is well exercised in that work of becoming more beautiful. And since you already are all so beautiful, to become even more beautiful and ever more beautiful would exactly be an example of someone who goes through the inferno first, not start in the paradisio, because that would be awkward. You'd be like, hey, can I... Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back to the beginning. I'm sorry about that. But to move from and up to higher and higher realms of the Paradiso toward the love that moves the sun and other stars. So may we all do that. So thank you so much for your time on this lovely evening. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Pleasure, gang. Have a good night.
You guys rock. You all rock.